Snow gnawed the ears and seeped under collars and gauntlets and into every seam as if it were a living thing seeking purchase in warm flesh. Jon stood before the opened gate of Winterfell, Longclaw's weight and old, cold comfort in his hand. Under gray sky and on the pale crust of the yard, banners stirred. The flayed man of House Bolton hanging sallow as a wound, the dire wolf of House Stark black as a shadow against white, the crescent moon and falcon of the Vale bright as hoarfrost. On the battlements, men watched with the hollow patience of the truly cold, breath ghosting. Davos Seaworth's gaze took a brief circuit of the assembled soldiers and returned to Jon's face. "You're sure?" he said, not quite a question. "There are fewer ways to fail," Jon answered, and heard his own voice as if it were someone else's. He had left his own voice at the wall and reclaimed this one after the knife, but it sometimes came to him like sound through a snowstorm, half-muffled and, at the edges, unreal. "Fewer dead, if the gods are kind. The old gods are as kind as they ever were." Davos's mouth wanted to smile and could not, which is to say, not kind at all. Tormund Giantsbane gave a low grunt. "I don't care which of you Southerners kills who, so long as the killing ends. But if the bastard tries any of his clever sport, I'll have the skin off." Jon shook his head once. "No, this has to be clean." Tormund spat into the snow and raised his shoulders as though they formed a shield. "It won't be clean. You know that." He did. Ramsay Bolton could no more fight cleanly than a pit dog could stop slathering at the scent of blood. But there were other eyes here, Karstark and Umber, Serwyn and Hornwood, Glover's men dark in their furs, Manderly's stout soldiers in their sea-green cloaks, and the steel-gray ranks of the Vale arrayed like a folded wing above the ice-slick ditch. They were all tired, tired unto bones and marrow, tired of the flayed man, tired of riding to a dead man's music. The duel would let them end it without another day's hell. If it was won, if the gods observed a human line drawn on snow. Sansa had stood with him beneath the low arch of the gate, wrapped in a plain cloak, her auburn hair hidden under an unadorned hood, her face a pale oval the wind could not color. She had not begged and had not commanded. She had looked at him as if she could see into him and weigh what he would choose. And when she had spoken, it had been soft, steady. "If he accepts, 1,000 men will not die today. I don't know if he will accept. He's cruel and he's proud," she had said. "He cannot refuse a stage. Give him one." So they had. They had sent a herald with a white flag and the old words to arrange a parley. And then, on packed snow before the heart of their home, Jon had put it plainly where every lord and sergeant could hear, his voice a cold river. "Ramsay Snow," he had said the bastard name deliberately, and heard a ripple pass through the gathered like wind through pine boughs. "You say you are the warden of the north. You say Winterfell is yours by right. Put words aside. Put men aside. Decide it on steel. You and I." Ramsay had smiled the peculiar smile that never reached his eyes. He had stood under a flayed man banner. His cloak was white as if he meant to disappear into the snow, and his leather was clean and supple, and his gloves looked soft enough to be a lady's. He had glanced to either side as though expecting someone to laugh at a jest. "My good cousin," he had murmured in a voice that carried well enough, "do you tire of breathing? I think you tire of breathing." Jon had said nothing. He had not moved. He had simply waited. The yard itself seemed to hold its frozen breath. Ramsay tilted his head and, for the briefest moment, looked bored. "Very well," he had said, and had even made a little flourish like a mummer presenting his cap. "Let us give the North a tale to tell." Now the ring was grown from men and spears, a circle of iron and fur, and Jon Royce of the Vale stood as witness with Lyanna Mormont as the other, the girl's tiny figure a stiff and fearless black knot in the white. "No archers," Royce said, his voice a rasp of gravel. "No hounds, steel in hand. The loser's men will stand down." Harold Karstark's gaunt face had not quite managed to sneer and not quite managed to assent. Small John Umber grunted something that could have been anything. The old gods were invoked, not with carved idols and incense, but with a silence so deep the falling snow sounded like ash settling. "How will we keep a Bolton from cheating?" Tormund muttered from the ring's edge. "We can't," Davos said simply. "But we can make it obvious." A hush fell upon the hush. A colder quiet nested inside the first, as Ramsay stepped into the ring. He moved with the loose ease of a man who trusts his own luck. He had no helm. He had chosen twin blades, short and quick. They flashed like teeth when he drew them. He turned a little, taking the measure of the ground, as if he could plan the fight like a hunt. Jon stepped in opposite. He untied his cloak and let it fall. He had slept, if that was what you could call it, under that cloak in rime and ash and the reek of horses, and he watched it go down into the snow and did not think of the wall it had been on the night he died. Longclaw hung in his hand with a familiar heaviness. The pommel's wolf's head caught a stray light, and he remembered the sound of his father's bootsteps across rushes, the clatter of steel in the yard by the broken tower, the chapped hands of Ser Roderick, the silent watchfulness of Maester Luwin. He remembered Ygritte's laugh and the crackle of a hearth someplace far to the south that he had never yet seen. He did not remember dying. He remembered opening his eyes. Ramsay advanced first with that same amused air, as though he had time to try on several approaches, as though the thing he was about to do was only daily diverting. He cut a neat diagonal feint to test distance and danced back before Longclaw could come down, not so far as to lose place, far enough to show he would not be taken by the simple blows. "Do you know, cousin," he said gently, "I've peeled men who were less nervous than you look." Jon did not answer. He did not think of answers. He thought of steps, of where Ramsay would place his foot, of where his own had to be. Snow made everything treacherous, and one bad step could be the last. Ramsay flicked forward again, twin knives a slicing blur, drawing first blood. A line across Jon's forearm shallow as a cattail cut. The knife kissed but did not bite. The sting bloomed warm in cold air like a rising ember. Jon did not flinch. Ramsay's eyes glittered. He took another small parcel of ground, and another, as if the yard were a board and each move set up a later trap. Twice he let his left hand lead, twice the right. He was quicker than he looked, almost quick as a Sellsword who had lived long enough to be gray. And he was cunning in his way. He tried to lure, to taunt the forward rush, to draw Longclaw away, and always, the knives returned to guard like twin snakes coiling home. Jon knew that dance. He had seen it in the tunnels under Castle Black when boys tried to prove to each other they were men, and in the wildling camps where a glance could be a challenge, and on the frozen lake when light played tricks with distance and death traveled in silence beneath a thin skin of ice. He did not try to catch both snakes. He let one strike where it would and met it with the flat, and when the other came for his ribs, he moved as Corn Halfhand had taught him to move, without pride, without hurry, without the need to win this second, ready to win the next. The first real chance came quick and looked like anything but a chance. Ramsay slipped on a patch of ice. Slipped so lightly he might have meant to do it, and whipped a blade up where no blade should be. Jon pivoted, took the nick on his leather rather than on his belly, and brought Longclaw around in an arc that would have taken a man slower or one too proud to bend. Ramsay did bend. He flowed under the sword, rolled, and came back up grinning, breath unclouded, like a fox who had found a new hole. "You're not as stupid as you look," he murmured, and then he changed. The change was not in the knives. It was in the way he held them, in the way his steps pressed rather than teased. He came on with intent now, with hunger, and Jon met him with short, ugly cuts, sacrificing grace to keep the knives off him. Once, twice, Longclaw bit leather and scraped iron. Once, twice, a Bolton blade hissed like cold water on the stove of Jon's mail, sparking. He felt himself begin to tire, as if someone were turning the wind against him. Ramsay saw it like a hound scenting blood. He tried to drive him, to push his back foot into a rut, to put him down where colorless slush sat on packed snow and would take his weight oddly. Jon gave ground when he had to and took it again when he could. His breath made long white coils in the air and broke. There was a disturbance in the ring, a human convulsion that was the bodies of two men as guards caught one who had started forward. And in that second, Ramsay flicked his gaze past Jon's shoulder, just a sliver. Jon almost took the bait and did not. He let Ramsay look and looked nowhere. When the blow came from the place Jon already feared, the low strike, far hand, meant to cut the tendon and end him to a kneel. He was ready in a way that had little to do with thought and everything to do with old bones remembering the rhythm of blade and step. He dropped his blade to meet the knife, the sound sharp and small in the cold air. The knife skittered. Ramsay snarled outright, losing his cultivated amusement, and went for the other leg, but Jon did the ugly thing. He stepped into it and used his shoulder as a weapon, used his own body as something meant to hit, and for the first time Ramsay stumbled as if he had not foreseen the indignity of being struck like a cart with the shafts broken. They separated, breathing hard, and for an instant Jon saw him. Not the smiling young lordling with white leather and good boots, but a boy with blue, cold eyes and a mouth that knew nothing but want. A boy who had reached for what he liked and got it because no one had ever cut off his hand for it. That boy was angry now. That boy did not like being resisted. And that boy, for all his cruelty, had not learned patience the way wolves learn winter. Ramsay came in a burst. He aimed where he had opened flesh before, tried to make the cut a door he could reopen and walk through. Jon let him try. Then he took the bite on his vambrace and trapped Ramsay's left hand. Twisting. Something gave with a small crack. Ramsay hissed and his right hand swam in with the other knife to compensate. But Jon had already put his foot behind Ramsay's heel. They went down, a knot of leather and iron and breath and snow. The world constricted to frost, to the bright necessity of not letting the knives find his throat. Jon felt one cold kiss slide along his collar, hot after a heartbeat as it drew a thread of blood. He jammed his forearm against Ramsay's wrist, forced his other arm across Ramsay's chest, and they writhed in the dirty snow like two animals in a trap. Ramsay's left hand still worked well enough to rake. Jon felt clawed and bitten, and he did the thing he did not want to do. He headbutt, short and low and nasty, and Ramsay blinked blood from his eyes and laughed, delighted. "You are an animal," Ramsay breathed. "Good." A shadow flickered across Jon from the yard's edge, and for a breath, this close, he saw the small shape of a crossbow quarrel set into the post by the gate, half hidden in frost. For one heartbeat he understood how the rest of it was meant to go, the stumble, the baited glance, the trigger hidden under a gow. Lur's glove, and he felt fury surge through him, simple and clean as hot wine. Not at the cheating, at the emptiness of it, at the predictability, at the insult to all those watching who had come to believe that somewhere under cruelty was courage. He drove his shoulder again, not to break anything, but to clear space and get his knee inside. He got it and heaved. Ramsay went over with a grunt, and when they came apart with Jon on his feet, long claw somewhere to his right, half buried in slush. Ramsay still had one knife. He came up like a spring, that knife set to taste belly. Jon kicked. The blade flew. Ramsay stared at his empty hand, blinked, looked almost astonished, and Jon did not think. He crossed the distance 2 steps can make a life and planted his fist on Ramsay Bolton's jaw once and then again, not wild, not killing, just enough to make a space where death could fit. He felt Longclaw's grip under his hand without looking. He had swung that sword in winter and in thaw and in a wildling hall with a roof of hide, and it came up as it always came, as if his arm were longer with it than without. Ramsay had stumbled, dropped to a knee, tried to rise, and it would have been decent to let him rise, to let him stand for it, but decency was for halls with songs. This was the yard of a house whose walls had seen too much. Jon took a breath that bit the back of his throat. He saw Sansa on the edge of the ring, her face still and pale, her eyes unreadable. He saw the painted eyes of the flayed man flickering red in a draft. He saw a boy he had failed to save running across churned snow with arrows in his wake. He brought Longclaw down. The first blow cut Ramsay's shoulder and bit bone. He reeled. The second took him through the collar and into the ribs, and the sword sang with it, a brief, ugly song. Ramsay went down as if the ground reached up and pulled him. He rolled and tried to find his feet, and Jon stepped with him and put the edge under the ribs and moved his arms the way he would split firewood. When the breath went out of Ramsay, it went out in a single, surprised sound, a small thing to carry all the harm that lived within him. He blinked up at the gray sky in time to see snow catch on his lashes and not melt. He smiled once, Even then, a broken, sad little smile, and then he was still and his blood made a blackness in the snow. No one cheered. Jon Royce said in the tone of a man giving a judgment he would have rather not given, "It is done." Harold Karstark stared, jaw gone slack, a grotesque yawn opening onto nothing. Small John Umber swore under his breath and lowered his axe point. John stood where he had stood, blade in hand, breath smoking. He looked at Ramsay's body a long time, a time stretched long by the cold and the watching. When he lifted his eyes, he saw Sansa move. She took one step, then two, and some of the men moved to stop her because that is what men do around ladies. But Davos held up a gloved hand and they did not touch her. She stepped over the ring of trampled snow and walked to the corpse of the man who had ruled Winterfell with fear and sport. She looked down, her chin lifted, and at last she let out a breath that shook as it left her. Her voice carried just far enough. "Tell the kennel master to feed the hounds," she said. "No more starving for any man's pleasure. Tear down his banners. Burn them, all of them." Her eyes rose to the walls and the leering flayed men painted there. "Scrape that filth away." Took a long while to move the men. It took a long while to peel back obedience from habit. But with the body cooling in the snow, with the old god's silence all around, the stubborn work began. Torches were fetched, ladders scritched against old stone. Men climbed. They pulled down the red men and their pink skins. The banners with the flayed man were tugged free and dropped like shed skins into the snow, then into fire. Smoke rose that smelled of old grease and new resolve. One, silent until then, rumbled once like distant thunder and plucked a painted board from high under the roof, splintering it between fingers thicker than a man's arm, and the cheer that went up then was small but real. Harold Karstark made a motion as if to speak and did not. He looked at the dead man, then at the live girl, then at Jon Royce's silent veil men in their ranks, and passed them to the men of houses he had alienated one by one with his choice to stand beside flaying knives. He put his sword down on the snow very carefully, as if it were a child and the snow were a bed. "I'll have no more of it," he said. He looked at Jon, then Sansa. "Your pardon, my lady, my lord. I stood where my anger put me. I am here now." Small John Umber spat, perhaps at Ramsay, perhaps at himself, and started to say something coarse. Lyanna Mormont turned her small head and looked at him, and whatever clumsy thing he had meant to say died mid-birth. He too placed his axe on the ground and stood back from it. The Ospreys and Serwins and Hornwoods followed the motion like a flock. The loyalty was not yet love, but it was a shape you could pour love into and let it set. Jon wiped Longclaw clean, slowly, methodically, as if he could wipe clean more than blood. He sheathed it. His hand trembled once and was still. "Open the cells," he said. "All that are unjust." A silence like a sucked-in breath went through the yard, and then men were moving and keys were fetched. Jon walked with Sansa into the keep. He had not slept in since before he wore a black cloak. The air inside tasted of old smoke and cold rushes and the tang of something spoiled. Torches made dim islands of light along the corridor. They passed through a hall where girls had once stitched by a window, into a passage where a man's body had been found long years past, into a low staircase that went down into the dark. The lock at the bottom protested, then yielded. The cells were like all cells, low and damp and smelling of fear lay down like paint in layers. Sansa lifted her torch. In the last cell, beyond the shadows of two empty ones, a small figure sat against the wall with his knees pulled up. He did not look up. For a heartbeat, Sansa did not move. She made a sound she had kept out of her throat since childhood. The catching breath of a girl who has finally seen the thing she has looked for every day since she left home. Jon's hand was already on the bar. He shoved and the iron groaned, and then they were inside. The torchlight jumped and Rickon lifted his head. He had grown like a weed in hard dirt. His hair was longer and matted where someone had cut it with a rough blade and then not bothered again. His eyes were too big for his face. He looked at Sansa not as at a sister, but as at a stranger who had spoken his language in a far country. His mouth opened and something like a word came out that might have been her name, or might have been any sound at all. He did not stand. He did not move. Sansa went to her knees and put the torch down and reached for him with both hands as though he might break. He flinched, not away from fear but away from touch he could not yet bear. Then he swayed, little as a branch under new snow, and leaned into her and put his face in her shoulder and breathed as if learning how one breathes when not counting lashes of a whip. Jon stood with his hand on the jamb, watching. His throat ached. He had wanted to make some vow to the gods, some oath that if they let him see this he would do anything they asked, but he had learned what gods do with oaths. He stood and let himself feel whatever this was, too large for joy, too strange for grief, bigger than both, as sharp as the cold. Sansa withdrew enough to search Rickon's face, to lift his chin as Catelyn had once done to each of her children when she wanted to read them. "We're here," she said, and this time the word was not a plume in the air. It was a hearth. He nodded as if he had always known they would come. Children sometimes trust the world like that, even after it has proven it does not deserve it. "Shaggy dog," he said to his sister, to the ground, to 2 years ago. Sansa did not tell him there was no shaggy dog. She swallowed and kissed his forehead and said, "You're needed." And he nodded again because he could do that, because he was a Stark and Starks nod at need and then stand. When they came back into the light, the yard was different. It seemed larger and emptier without the flayed men leering down, warmer with fires set to melt ice in places that needed thaw. Men who had worn Bolton colors stood uncertain as spare parts. Lyanna Mormont stood on a cask and addressed them with the gravity of a tiny granite statue, telling them exactly where they would work and how long they would work and what would happen if they did not. When she saw Rickon, she did not make a fuss. She jumped down, came up, and looked him up and down like a woman measuring timber. "You'll do," she said, and then to Jon, "He needs broth." Sansa smiled with her eyes and took Rickon's hand. They put him by the fire, and he ate slowly, and he watched the flames as if they were a creature he had not met. Tormund hunkered nearby and surely invented a ridiculous tale about bears and ale in a low voice designed not to scare children. The sound of one's laugh, no more than a huff, rolled across the yard once and settled. Near dusk, when men's shadows made long spokes and the snow had fallen into a fine dry dust rather than flakes, Davos climbed the tower and came down with something wrapped in cloth. He found Melisandre waiting by the godswood, where the heart tree's carved face wept sap like frozen tears. The snow there was untouched save for a single set of prints. He held out the bundle and opened it. The little stag that had once sat on a child's table stared up between them, its antlers clumsy and endearing, one char streaking its flank. Davos's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "I found it where the army camped, south and west, at the place where the snows were red and then black. I thought I would not, but I did. Sometimes the gods are kind in their cruelties." Melisandre did not reach for the thing, though she looked at it like a prophet looks at a sign, uncertain if the word is for her alone. Her red eyes flared once and then dimmed. "I have done great sin in the name of a greater war," she said. "It is the way of—" "You lit a child on fire," Davos said. He did not raise his voice. His breath smoked in the cold and then was gone. "You and your king and your god and your need, you put her on wood and you lit a child on fire because you burned and wanted to see the world burn the same." Her gaze did not drop. "The Lord of Light requires—" "Your Lord can come to me," Davos said, and his voice shook just once, "and tell me himself what he requires of little girls." He looked past her to the heart tree. "But not here, not now, not anymore." Jon came upon them because he had thought to pray and had found instead a quarrel that could not be postponed. Davos held up the stag. "I thought the snows might cover it. The snows did not." Jon took the little toy in his hand. He remembered King Stannis's lean face and colder eyes, the way the man had looked at him as at a problem to be solved, the way he had folded his sadness inside an iron shell and called it duty. He remembered Shireen's smile and her awkward, brave curiosity, and the fullness in his throat taught him that the dead can rise not only from knives. "Is it true?" he asked the woman in red without anger. He had spent all his anger. Melisandre bowed her head. "Yes." Jon thought of all the reasons that could be bent into excuses and all the reasons that could be bowed into regret. and then he thought of the hour he had just spent swinging a sword at a man who took pleasure in pain. He looked at the heart tree and felt its mute attention. "Go. South, Melisandre," he said at last. "Before night becomes a wall you cannot pass. Keep out of my sight. If you come north again, I will do what Davos cannot." She studied him. Then she bowed as though he were a temple door and passed under, and the snow took her footsteps without a sound. Davos closed his eyes and looked suddenly very old, and then he managed a weak smile and put his hand on Jon's shoulder and squeezed. That night, Winterfell was a house under work. Men scrubbed and scraped and burned. Banners were redone. Lines were redrawn. The kitchens produced pottage that was thick enough to honor the cold, and ale enough to soften it. A boy who was a lord in name and a child in fact slept in a room still and silent and too big. His sister sat in a chair by the window and watched the snow drift sideways like a shawl and let her hands be idle for the first time in years. When sleep found her, it did not come as a thief but as a promise that her watch could be shared. Jon walked the walls as if his boots had learned it as a rhythm in childhood. Winterfell had grown since he left and also not grown. It had added memory in layers like the smell of smoke in stone. He had watched men die in 100 shades of gray, and he had watched a man die under his hand, and it did not feel like victory, and it did not feel like nothing. It felt like a door opening somewhere to a very long hall. The wind lifted the hair at his neck. He looked north and thought he could taste the dry cold that meant snow would fall for days, weeks, months, all through this winter that was promised. He wondered, not for the first time, why men spend so much blood for stones when the darkness beyond those stones cares nothing for them. In the morning, a raven came from White Harbor with words pressed small on vellum in a hand full of arches. Wyman Manderley sent pledges and fat horses and salted fish and a sly note that hinted the south was burning quieter than rumor supposed. From the west came a whisper that fry pies were hearty this season, and that a girl with eyes like winter had been seen where winter had no right to be. From King's Landing came a black-winged rumor, wildfire blooming green as spring in a great stone heart, a queen crowned where a queen had burned, a boy king fallen. The particulars flowed in days later. The air around the tales always smelled faintly of smoke. In the great hall, where the banners had been raised to show old allegiances, men and women gathered, and Sansa sat where her mother had sat. The first time she did it, there was a hush, then a murmur of approval, then a cautious brightness like candles catching. Rickon, in smaller furs than his stature wanted and with a gravity that was less grim than careful, was presented to the assembled. He stood straight, swallowed, and thanked them all for coming home. The simplicity of it was not weakness. It was the privilege of a child returned not to an inheritance but to a hearth. Lyanna Mormont stood and was herself. She named the treacherous and named the brave, and when she came to Jon she did not call him Lord. She called him what he had been to her when she wrote back from Bear Island with ink as sharp as a spear's point. A Stark where it counted. "We have a boy to bear the name for us," she said, nodding at Rickon with a crisp regard that would brace a weaker man's heart. "We have a man to bear the burden." She turned those iron eyes on the hall. "If the dead come by the hundreds, we will not give them one of ours. King in the north," someone murmured because habit is a force, and then people glanced at one another, weighed tradition and hope and the living child before them. It might have surged into a chant in another hall, in another time. It did not hear. Wyman Manderley stood, belly like a bastion, eyes shrewd, and spoke for a third path. "We've had kings, and what did it bring us? I'll sing that song when we're free of winter's bite. Now we need hearth and shield. Let the boy be Lord of Winterfell as his fathers were, and let Jon Snow be his hand, or call it steward as the old kings did. He's done the work already." Sansa did not move. She watched Jon across the room. He met her look, and something eased in his face that had been tight since dawn. He nodded once, and she let out a breath she had not known she had held. The hall agreed in a wave of murmur and assent, and the shape of their governance settled like snow filling old tracks. In the days that followed they learned what a house is when it remembers itself. The godswood was tended and the broken branches trimmed. The crypts were swept and the dust of stone shaken off carved faces so that old Starks could watch with unblind eyes. Men trained in the yard, not in the showy cuts of mummers but in short, deliberate drills that made muscles ready. Davos oversaw the counting of grain with a merchant's ruthlessness and a father's anxiety. Tormund took a cohort of free folk to the last hearth with letters that were plain and to the point. Bolt your doors against the wind and the dead both. Jon Royce sent birds to the Eyrie to convert presents into pledge and made a point of keeping Baelish's name out of any letter that mattered. Peter Baelish came anyway, in a sleigh with bells too delicate for the weather, smiling like a man who has discovered a lost coin. He bowed to Sansa and looked at her not as he would look at a lord's daughter, but as he would look at a blade he hoped to wield. "My lady," he murmured. "When I pictured myself at your side in this hall." Sansa stood very straight. She wore no jewels and had placed a plain dirk at her hip. She drew in one breath, enough to say a sentence without breaking. "I am grateful for the aid of the Vale," she said, so that Jon Royce would hear and be honored and the men in gray and blue behind him would see their service acknowledged. She did not look at Baelish when she said it. When she looked back at him, she did not smee. "Le. You will lodge in the East Tower. We have much work to undo and little time. If you have counsel that serves the North, I'll hear it. If you have other counsel, keep it to yourself." He laughed and colored, both at once. "You always were Ned Stark's daughter." She felt the blow as if it were praise and refused to let it sting. When he came too close to Rickon during the feast that night, she placed herself between them as if by accident. And when he whispered to her about lovers and destinies in an alcove where once her father had kept old maps, she said, "I am a Stark of Winterfell," and watched the words land on his face like snow on a hot stone. "Are you?" he said softly, and might have said more, but footsteps approached, and it was Jon who came out of a shadow, not hurrying, not making a show of it, and Baelish faded back into the hall like smoke into the rafters. Later, he would try to slip loyalties out of men's hands with promises of power in springtime, but now he was a grown man in a winter house where children had learned to grow into steel. Samwell Tarly's first raven took weeks to arrive and then arrived 3 in a clutch, as if the birds themselves understood that what they bore could not be adequately said at once. The letters had ink smudged by an inky thumb and a haste he could not conceal even with neat script. At the Citadel there is more knowledge than any one man needs and less than the world wants, Jon read in the first. That's how it feels when you swim in words. But there is one truth I can pull from the sea. Dragonglass will kill them. Obsidian. There is more of it than in shards from the shore. There is a mountain of it, in fact, under Dragonstone. It is written in 100 books, and in one book no one reads. I think you ought to come and take as much as you can carry. The second letter contained a note in an infuriated hand from an archmaester who disliked sending secrets to boys who had not earned them, and a schematic of old tunnels beneath an island shaped like a dragon at flight. The third was simply, "Please do not die. There's no time for it." Jon read them on the wall walk with the wind hectoring his cloak and the snow pricking his face. He looked down at the yard where Rickon was learning to string a bow from an old huntsman who had taught Robb once, and where Sansa spoke to Karen men about the difference between mercy and softness, and where Tormund's laugh seemed to make the ice melt around the edges of a trough. He felt the weight of a choice settle on him like a hand. That night he spoke in the hall to those whose voices carried weight. "There's stone that kills the dead, under Dragonstone. The Targaryen girl sits there now with her ships and her fire-made flesh. If I go to her, I go to a stranger. If I do not, I say to the dead that we are not yet serious about living." "You cannot leave the boy," Wyman said, frowning, and it was oddly touching to see a man of his age and girth frown as if he had been asked to leave a pie half-eaten. "I will not leave him unarmed," Jon said. "If we do not find a way to craft weapons that kill the White Walkers, we are already gone. I'll bend my knee if that's what buys us a mountain of black glass and the chance to put it into 1,000 men's hands. It is not about pride. It is about the cold." "Bend your knee to a girl who whispers in foreign," Harold Karstark muttered, finding pettiness a warm cloak when the wind rose. "Bend your knee to the Winter Queen if she brings summer with her," Lyanna Mormont snapped, and Harold shut his mouth. "I care nothing for your pride, Snow. I care for axes that do not bounce off blue bones." Sansa studied Jon's face and then looked down at where her fingers lay folded, and then up at him again. "You can go if I stay," she said. "And I will. I will keep the boy in the house, and we will make weapons, and we will drill every child who can pull a string. We will mend the east wall, and we will send scouts whose feet don't sap the snow where they go. We will not fall asleep because the fire's warm." He nodded, feeling both relief and regret as bitter companions. "Davos will come with me." "Davos won't like boats," Tormund observed with glee. "Davos will like boats if you give him something at the end of the journey that kills his enemy." Davos grunted and rubbed his jaw and then, after a pause, smiled with a single side of his mouth and clapped Jon's shoulder. They left Winterfell in a caravan that had more ravens than men. The road to White Harbor was a siege of wind. They traveled with Vale Knights and a few hardened freefolk and a smith named Arobet with hair like straw who had agreed to learn to melt and shape obsidian if it killed him. At White Harbor, Wyman Manderley fed them on fish chowder rich enough to make a southern lord cry and put them on a swift ship with shallow draft. Davos stood on the deck and tried not to hate the sea. Jon stood at the prow and watched a world made of gray, sky and water one seamless cloth, and thought of dragons that were not all legend. Dragonstone was a black tooth in the water, and as they came around its point, Jon saw the smoke from the mountain's throat and the outline of an old fortress that seemed grown from cooled lava. He had thought he would feel some awe, but he felt only a steadiness. This place had waited a very long time for someone to open its floor and take what it had to give. They had a parley on the beach where the surf made a noise like tearing cloth. Jon did not kneel but did not draw himself to his full height either. He addressed the woman with the pale hair and the calm eyes and the careful posture. She listened with her hand resting on a dark-skinned woman's arm in a gesture that said she trusted. A man with a handsome, sardonic face watched everything as if it were a joke with a second punchline. The two dragons in the sky were quiet, which was more unnerving than if they had screamed. "I have no quarrel with you," Jon said. "I have a quarrel with the night that walks. I have men who will put their backs into shaping glass if I bring the glass. I have a house that will give you grain when grain is dear if you give me stone when stone is dear. I have a boy who is a lord because a cruel man died. I have a winter that will test us all." The woman, who named herself Daenerys Stormborn and Queen of the Undulls and all the titles a girl can be forced to carry when men build empires, listened and did not scoff. "You are the man who died and rose," she said in a tone like the far edge of curiosity. "I am the man who died and still owes debts," Jon said. "What would you give me now?" she asked. "Truth," Jon said, and surprised himself. "And a friendship my house has not spent cheaply. And a promise. I will not take from you what you have bled to hold. But the war I bring is not the war you've prepared for." She looked at her dragons as if deciding if they were hers or the world's. "You shall have the glass," she said at last. "And you shall come with me when I go north. We can argue on the road about crowns." They did not argue much. There was work, a mountain's worth of it, and even a queen cannot command a mountain. Men who had melted iron learned how glass likes to be worked. They made arrowheads that glittered like black ice and daggers that were ugly and deadly and spear points that sang when set to wood. Caravans went north under the protection of dragons that wheeled high and made small the bowman's ambition. A boat sank in a squall and 30 spearheads kissed salt and vanished. There were curses. There were more spearheads. Back in Winterfell, Sansa ruled in a way that made rule simply the work of getting through a day. She did not call it ruling. She sat with mothers and with masters of horse. She counted wood and men and small wheaten loaves. She received a letter from the twins that said nothing and felt like a cut. She received Arya. Her sister came up the east road wearing a different face and put it off in the snow like a cloak and stepped into Sansa's arms as if she had been born to do only that. There were tears, and there was laughter afterward so sudden and so free the men at the gate smiled into their collars as if the frost had made them sheepish. Arya ate 3 trenchers and 2 apples and 1 piece of meat that had been meant for someone else. She took her place opposite Sansa at a board and listened to the sound of the house as if it were a song she had almost forgotten. Later, she stood in the yard with Brienne of Tarth, who had arrived with the wind and with a solemn promise from Riverrun in her pocket. And they circled one another with friendly blades and made the watching boys gasp. Peter Baelish watched that with narrowed eyes and tried to find a seam in the house that would fit a wedge. He found few. Once, he found Sansa in a corridor where winter light made her look like someone's memory. And he tried to show her a future where he would sit at her side and whisper the names of her enemies into her hair. "You killed my aunt," she said in that same corridor. And he paused and smiled sadly as if she had recalled a cradle song. "And you delivered me to a monster," she went on. "And then you fed me words sweet as rotten fruit. I may eat your counsel if I starve, Peter, but I'll vomit it out. You can stay because the veil is here. You can leave when they are safe in their own mountains. If you linger then, I'll cut the lingering out of you." He opened his mouth, then closed it, then bowed again and smiled like a man who had once loved and had found that love an inconvenient fact to place anywhere. He was not the sort of man who leaves for love. He stayed and behaved. He wrote letters with invisible ink and got little for them. He tried to whisper in Arya's ear once and found himself staring at a face he had not expected to see. He did not try again. News met Jon half a day from Eastwatch by the sea. A wind out of the north that had no lungs, a noise like a drum with no drummer, snow changing the angle of its fall not to follow wind but to follow will. When he reached the wall, he found Tormund on the parapet, hair blown into a crown of ice, grinning like a man about to fight a bear with his bare hands. "Thought you'd never come," Tormund said, and clapped him hard enough to jar his teeth. "Thought you'd decided to sit in your stone house and argue with girls." Jon grunted. "We have glass." "Good. Slap it on sticks. The dead are done waiting." They were. Scouts came back with breath like smoke and eyes wide as if they had seen the void look back and find them interesting. The first wave arrived at the last hearth, and what had been a house where Umber boys raced around trunk and branch and learned to swear at age 9 became a wheel of blue and white. The Umber holdouts who had tied themselves to Bolton pride gave their lives unstintingly under a banner that showed a giant bound and broken and whole again. They fell. Tormund burned them where they lay, and the smoke went up with a smell that never leaves a man. Jon rode through a world the color of bone and battle. He left Eastwatch and the last safe line like a man stepping off a precipice and found in himself not bravery but the absence of the alternative. He had thought he had seen the dead at Hardhome and that they had taught him fear, but he learned a truer lesson now. The dead do not tire. They do not hate. They do not prize. They simply arrive. That is what Jon. He brought lords of small keeps who had boarded their doors against raiders and and the raiders had no lungs and no need of doors. He brought a shard of a White Walker's blade, black and slick and dead, wrapped in a cloth that would not warm it. He brought Daenerys the truth again, and she did what queens do when they are worthy. She believed, not because she loved him but because she listened to too many men and women whose words did not tremble. They went north together with dragons beating the air like great, relentless hearts. The first time Drogon swept low over Winterfell's towers, the stones themselves seemed to lean away. Every arrow slit a shocked eye. Arya laughed aloud. Sansa did not. Rickon stood with his hands in fists and felt the old stories become animals with breath. In the yard, old Nan would have told stories of dragons curled around kings like cats. There was no old Nan. Sansa did not offer shelter to myths. She offered shelter to armies and bread to mouths and plans to men who needed someone to tell them where to stand. She walked the line of the wall with Jon and Daenerys and tried to see not how to keep her house but how to keep the light within it from going out. Bran came home with the snows heavy and the ravens docile on the branch. He did not weep. He did not smile. He went to the Godswood and placed his hand upon the heart tree like a boy claiming a father he had only heard about. He looked at Sansa and saw her. He looked at Jon and saw him more than Jon knew how to be. The truth that Bran carried was not an arrow or a crown. It was a key that opened a door to a room with a mirror. He told it under the red boughs while the snow fell gently. Jon listened and felt the shape of himself shift, though he did not move. He did not announce it that night or the next. He went among his men and learned which had broken boots and which had broken hearts, which had old grudges and which had new ones, which had a song they sang under their breath to make courage. He took his place at Rickon's right and Sansa's left and let himself be seen as something solid. The dragons crouched beyond the wall like great boats pulled up onto a shingle in a storm. When the dead came to Winterfell, they came not like a flood but like a slow, deliberate tide that refuses to admit the moon. They came with a cold that squeezed sound and flattened fire and made breath sting as if lungs were cloth beaten on a stone and wrung out by invisible hands. They came with the patience of hunger. Jon had arrayed what he had: infantry in layered furs with dragonglass points, archers who would fire once and then throw away their bows, free folk whose courage did not depend on orders, knights from the Vale who had learned to stand in a broken field, manderly men stout as barrels. In the center, a boy with a sword 2 sizes too big for him watched and tried not to be a boy. Sansa wore mail under a heavy dress, the compromise a lady of a great house makes in a world that does not pause to decide if ladies ought to fight. Arya wore nothing but the movement that keeps a body from dying. Davos kept the hearths in the inner bailey stocked as if they were hearts themselves. Brienne stood with her head bare to the snow and her sword bared to anything colder than weather. The men and women of Winterfell took their place in a circle that had been drawn when stone first met frost. The first clatter of bone against wood was not monstrous. It was like a finger tapping at a door. The second was like a fist. The third was like a body thrown. Then there was no time to name sounds. There was only the work. They held. Jon thought that if he died now he would die less astonished than the last time, which is not the same as dying unafraid. Daenerys learned that fire does not always frighten what is already past fear, but that it breaks them when it must. Drogon and Rhaegal went blazing across the snow and left melted corridors where men could breathe without frost burning their lips. The dead fell in piles that did not remain still, and fire burned until a wind came that subdued even flame's wild heart. Bran waited under the heart tree, eyes milky with ravens and whatever he saw beyond ravens. And the Night King came for him as if coming to claim property lost long ago. The creature moved like memory, like frost spreading under a pane of glass, confident of its world. Jon intercepted the thing once, twice, put dragonglass against it and threw it, killing what it brought with it like handmaidens. He swung Longclaw with one hand and a spear with the other as if his arms had learned new lengths. Arya moved across the ground like a shadow shaking loose from its object. She remembered hallways and faces and the taste of coins and the cold of stone and the feel of a winter wolf on her back, and she went where she needed to go. Sansa stood with Rickon and did not flinch when men fell near her. She sent the boy away when she had to, not because he was a child, but because he was their future. In the end, it was many things that broke the cold. It was dragonglass in rough hands and a smith who had learned to love an ugly black stone. It was a dragon's fire and a queen's will and a free folk leader's laugh and a woman in mail who had sworn an oath to a dead woman and kept it. It was a boy's courage and a girl's knife. It was the old gods watching without blinking because gods do not blink. The living blink for them. It was Jon standing where he had to stand, not because he craved glory but because he had learned there are places where you cannot ask another to stand in your place. Arya slipped in where others could not, through a world narrowed to a point. She had a blade that had tasted old blood and knew. She put it where blue flesh forgot it was not flesh. The creature that had believed itself a king made of night and purpose blinked, or the world blinked around it, and then it shattered, not with a noise like music but with a noise like ice underfoot breaking when spring remembered itself. The dead fell. The quiet that followed was a hurt more than a relief. Men and women wept in great, unseemly gulps that steam made small. Morning came in increments, not all at once. A gray that brightened at the edges, a wind that became a whisper instead of a scourge, crows that dared to call, a smell of smoke that was hearths and not horror. The yard at Winterfell looked like a battlefield, which is to say it looked like a place where people had refused to stop existing. Sansa walked among the living with a jug of beer that had been meant for celebration and was now for waking. She found Rickon and put a hand on his hair and felt how soft it still was. Arya slept bolt upright against a pillar with her knife in her lap and her head at an angle that would make a man's neck ache. Jon sat on the step where once a boy had sat sharpening a dull sword and did nothing for a time. Daenerys stood on the wall and looked north a long while, her hair unbound and bright as frost. By noon, wolves ran in the godswood. They were not ghosts or omens. They were animals alive. Not all had returned, the dead keep what they take. But the ones that lived made the trees seem less like the inside of a cathedral and more like a place where things nest. Bran slept and woke and looked at his siblings as if he had remembered something he had been afraid to remember. After the fires were lit for the dead and burned for a day and a night, after the ash drifted and settled and made new snow gray, they came back to the work of being alive. That work was heavy. Its heaviness was a blessing. They drank in the hall to those who would never drink again. They mended roofs and mended quarrels. They planned for a spring whose shape was unclear and did not need to be clear yet. A raven came from the south with a careful hand and a bleeding seal. It announced a queen on an iron seat who had come there by fire and treachery both, and a host that would come north if bidden to take any pledge that would make a conquered land into a kingdom. Sansa read it and passed it to Jon and said nothing for a long time while the snow at the window fell in clean, slightly slanted lines. Jon thought of his father and of the lesson that had turned itself into his life. Even when you win, the work begins again. "We will not bend our knee lightly," Sansa said at last. "Nor stiff-necked," Jon said. He looked to Rickon, who watched them both with gravity. "We have to think of wheat and of walls both. We have to think of children," she said. He nodded. He thought of a child born under the shadow of a tower and given a name to keep him safe. He thought of a boy who had learned to be a man in a place where boys were not meant to live. He thought of a girl who had survived by letting go of her face and learning to put it on again only when the house was safe. He thought of the dead, now properly dead, ash on snow. He thought of Ramsay Bolton and the day the snow was black with blood in the yard and the flayed men banners went down. He thought of the way Sansa had said, "Feed the hounds," and the sound of that mercy in a house that had needed it. "We will get through this winter," he said, and it was not bravado, and it was not hope alone. "And when spring comes, we will make the things we lived through into a story we can tell our children without lying." Sansa smiled, not because it was easy to imagine, but because a good lie had been told to her so many times that the first good truth made her want to see what it could build. "We'll tell them their aunt saved the world with a little knife," she said. "We'll tell them their mother made a city in this hall where people could eat and lay down their heads and wake to work instead of waking to fear," Jon answered, and did not take the words back when he realized what he had said. Sansa held that accidental word in her hands like a bird whose warmth surprises you. She did not release it. She did not cage it. "We'll tell them their uncle had stubbornness in him like northern iron," she said, and looked at Davos where he argued with a cook about the best stew to feed 100 men who had fought all night. "We will tell them that the North remembers," said Lyanna Mormont from beside the hearth, as though anyone could forget she was there. The great raven cage in the rookery was busy that winter and busy afterward. Messages went out like the web of a patient spider. They went to White Harbor and the Bar Rowlands, to the Sisters and Deepwood Mott, to the Rills and Torrens Square. Some went to the Vale and came back with yes that had no flourishes. One went as far as Old Town, and a boy who had eaten too much porridge and grown out of a timid shape into something bottomlessly loyal sent back sketches for traps that catch snow in the right way, designs for stoves that waste less heat, and a letter that made no mention of oaths because sometimes the best loyalty does not name itself. In the spring, men went into fields where bones still lay and sewed carefully around them, and women kneaded bread with hands that had been hard with calluses and were finally softening. The dragons rose often and farther, and then less often and closer, because a queen learns to live among those she would rule or else she rules only herself. Baelish left Winterfell with a polite nod and a pretense of being called away. He went into a world more suspicious than the one he had built, and found that suspicion undoes the craftiest loom. Jon Royce kept the Vale's loyalty in a hand that did not tremble. Harold Karstark married a widow of a house that had lost every man and learned that mercy keeps a woman's eyes on you in a better way than fear does. Small John Umber cried when he thought no one saw him and then broke 3 benches to make up for it and then built 4. Rickon grew. He learned to shoot as well as Bran had and to read men's eyes as well as Sansa had. He learned to listen to the godswood as Jon had, which is to say Hiel. earned to hear his own heart and not be too proud to say when it galloped. Arya came and went. She did not like the feel of walls for long, but she liked home when it could hold her. One night she sat on the parapet with Sansa, legs swinging out over the drop, and told her sister, a little at a time, how a name can be a blade you hide and a face can be a cloak you wear. Sansa did not ask her to stop, and she did not ask her to do more. She sat shoulder to shoulder and let the cold creep into them in the old way that makes sisters pull their shared cloak closer. Jon stood by the heart tree one evening when the sap had not yet begun to run and thought of his mother. He had not known her. He knew her now. He did not know what to do with that knowledge except carry it like any other burden. He thought of a crown not as a shining thing but as iron bent into a circle by strong fingers. He thought of what he owed and to whom. He thought, too, of Sansa's voice in the hall and the way Winterfell flourished under her quiet, unshowy care. He had seen kings. He had not seen many rulers. "Father," he said, and did not decide whether he was talking to Ned Stark or to a man with another name. "I chose to kill a man once and the world changed. I chose to let a woman go and the world changed. I chose to kneel to none and to kneel to someone and the world changed. I suppose that's what it does." The tree did not answer. The wind made a sound like leaves, though the leaves were as stiff as old parchment. He laid his palm on the bark and felt the strangeness of being alive, which is the oldest feeling and the freshest. When he turned to go, he saw Sansa on the path, and she looked at him not as she had looked at him when they were children, not as she had looked at him when they were strangers sharing a house again, but as a woman looks at a man who has grown beside her in fortune and in sense. They walked together as they did now, not needing to speak because speaking is one small part of the way family talks. "Do you remember the first snow the year Mother died?" Sansa said as they passed under a gate where ice had made a lace of itself and dripped pretty, deadly points. "It fell and the whole yard went quiet. Arya asked me how I could stand to be in a world that didn't change." "I don't remember that," Jon said. "I remember you brushing snow off a pup so gently it woke without knowing it was cold. We are not those children," she smiled to herself. "But I think we are who they hoped we would be." He considered that and let silence answer for him. At the steps to the hall, they paused together because it had become a habit to stop and look back at the yard, at the keep at the Godswood. The dragons were, for once, nowhere to be seen. The banners of House Stark hung clean and plain. The smell of cooking leaked just enough to promise supper. Rickon's laughter rang from the armory where he was arguing with a man twice his age about the right oil to use on leather in spring. Arya's steps whispered behind them, quick and light. This is what the world is when it is kind enough to let people keep it, Jon thought. Not a sweeping, grand thing, but a house with little tasks. He had killed a cruel man in the snow. In that quiet violence, the world had turned. He was not so foolish as to think that was the only reason it had turned, but he was sober enough to think that sometimes a blade crossed where all can see is not just steel. It is a pledge that what follows will be difficult and worth the difficulty. He glanced sidelong at Sansa. She looked ahead, into the hall, into the years, not afraid. They went inside together, as they had entered childhood together, as they had re-entered their home together, shoulder to shoulder, with winter still around them and spring not yet believed. They had made of their house not a fortress only, but a place where you could lay your burdens down by a fire and let your hands warm and your speech grow easy. That was not less than victory. It was the point of victory. And if the songs that would be sung one day failed to mention exactly how the snow felt on his face the moment he put his sword through a monster of a man, that was well. Songs are for making sense. Life had made its own. He had learned the only lesson the cold will ever teach. Endure for what is worth it. Yield when yielding keeps your people whole. And in the end, hold to one another like a fire holds to its own heat. That is how a winter ends. Not in a blaze, but in the slow, patient work of staying.